everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Brian Keane, online fitness coach and nutritionist and 3 times best-selling author, normally here to help you by deconstructing expert guests on all things health, fitness, and mindset. Today's podcast, we are going to keep on the mindset, but it's a solo episode. It's just me and my microphone talking through some of the core life lessons that I learned in my 30s, but really wish I knew in my 20s. This has been coming up a lot in my space. Today's podcast is actually brought to you by my coaching and mentorship program. If you run your own business or you're self-employed or you're a personal trainer or you work in the health and fitness industry or wellness industry, I've got a couple of physios working with me in my mentorship program. Today's podcast is brought to you by that and was actually the seed for today's episode. I'll put the link in the description for anyone that wants more details on that. For my business consulting, again, if you're outside of that and you work a normal 9-to-5 job and you have no aspirations to set up your own business, then it's not going to be for you. It's very specific for those who run their own business or have aspirations to become small business owners or business owners with personal training, health, wellness, and fitness. But talking to one of my mentees who's in his late 20s at the minute, I was running through indirectly on one of our 2-hour calls about some of the life lessons. It kind of veered that way because we had our business set up, we had the structure set up for the social media campaign, and he asked a question about, what's something that you wish you knew when you were my age? And I started rhyming off some of the things I'm going to talk about in today's podcast. So we are going to run through the 7 core life lessons that I learned in my 30s, but really wish I knew in my 20s. I am going to be 37 the end of this year. The 11th of December, I turned 37. And the last 6 years in particular, since I turned 30, a lot of things have been turned upside down in my life, some in a very positive way, some in not so positive a way, and you have to do some mental gymnastics to work through it. But all of it's made me stronger, and I think a more well-rounded person. But there are things that if you would have learned, or if I would have known going into my 30s, and this will be applicable hopefully to you if you're listening and you're in your 30s, your 40s, your 50s even. I think we're constantly students of life and learning different things as we go along, and you can learn something from nearly everybody you meet, even if it's what not to do, to quote the famous Abraham Lincoln line. And something that I made a mistake on was the first core lesson here. And those of you who have read The Fitness Mindset or Rewire Your Mindset, my first 2 books, will be very familiar with this principle. And that's that you're better to be at the bottom of the ladder against the right wall than halfway up the ladder against the wrong wall. This is something that encompasses all areas of my life. And I came up with the concept when I was working full-time as a primary school teacher. So just to give a little bit of backstory, some of you will be familiar with this, so I won't rehash the whole thing. But I worked as a primary school teacher for 4 years in London. And I did my undergraduate in Ireland in business and marketing. I did a postgraduate to become a primary school teacher in St. Mary's in Twickenham in London, and then walked into my first teaching job. And 20 minutes into my first day, which was a year 3 classroom in front of 37-year-old kids, and I thought to myself, I don't want to be a teacher. And I had spent years what I felt like climbing a ladder, only to realize that it was up against the wrong wall. And I've taken that metaphor and I've used it in so many different areas of my life because it crosses over from relationships, romantic and friendship, to business, to your fitness journey. Because a lot of us will have that moment in our life when we think we're on the right path. In my case, it was a career. I thought I wanted to be a primary school teacher. I never really actually went too deep on it. I just assumed it was something I would do. There was decent money. It was good holidays. I could play my sport around it. And a lot of my members were teachers. So it just made sense that I kind of followed that path. I never asked the question that I put in Rewire Your Mindset: what would you do for free? And teaching was never something I would have done for free. I knew every Friday I was getting off for the weekend, and I knew every Sunday night I was going back to work on Monday. When I took my ladder, figuratively and metaphorically, and moved it to the bottom of what was a one-to-one personal training business at the time, 2012 is when I started that. I was doing it part-time. I worked as a teacher during the day, and I worked as a personal trainer at nighttime and at weekends for 2 years. And then in 2014, I moved back in with my mum and dad my sister gave me her old little Toyota Yaris. Some of you have heard the story before. One of those cars that when you close the front door, all 4 windows would come down. So you had to be really gentle with the front door. And it got me to the gym. It got me to the point where I was able to get a one-to-one personal training business off the ground. And over the space of 2 years, I had to bring other coaches underneath me to clear a waiting list. And then in 2016, I moved online and have been online ever since with my programs. And when I went and I started to work with people in fitness, I got that feeling that some of you will have, some of you will have gotten, some of you might never experience this, where you get money for something that you can't believe you get paid for. And that was a kind of a realignment and a check-in for me that I'm on the right path. And it sounds paradoxical and it can sound counterintuitive, but I make considerably more money now than I ever did as a teacher. I remember in 2016, the first time that I made more money in a month than I did in a whole year of teaching, that I couldn't believe that I was getting to live that life. And I don't want to sound braggiose or bravado. It was very much a gratitude-based feeling that I can't believe I get to do something I love and I get paid so well for this. And the irony of doing something that you would do, quote unquote, for free normally means that you feel very passionate about it, you feel very inspired about it, and you end up unintentionally outworking others because you're doing in your free time work that others wouldn't do unless they got paid for it. And that's actually quite a secret sauce. And everybody has a version of this. And in 2024 and beyond, if you're listening to this in the back catalog, there's a lot of different things you can do. The internet, social media has been the great equalizer. And I'm somebody that has quite a traditional background in terms of a teacher, and I did all my certifications and qualifications in personal training and sports nutrition. I have a business degree, but a lot of people have those things. And social media and the internet was a great equalizer because there was no gatekeepers. You could write books and release them to people. You could do courses and serve people with them. You could scale programs and help people. And in this day and age, whether it's your job or a relationship or your fitness program, you can ask yourself, am I enjoying and do I have my ladder up against the right wall? When I competed in bodybuilding in 2015 and I was doing fitness model shows and bodybuilding competitions, very kind of bro lifestyle, not a very happy time in my life when it came to the image I was seeing in the mirror. Ironically, I developed body dysmorphia competing in bodybuilding shows. I never had any issues with my body or how it looked before that. But as I went into the world of bodybuilding and fitness modeling, I got really bad body dysmorphia and a mild eating disorder and had very disordered eating patterns, very strict for 6 weeks with chicken, broccoli, and rice. And I wouldn't touch any sugar or any salt. And then as soon as the show was over or as soon as a photo shoot was over, I could literally be eating Ben & Jerry's 2 or 3 tubs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Not even an exaggeration. And a couple of days later, I'd look like the Michelin Man. I'd be all bloated and I'd actually look like I was 3 or 6 months pregnant because I had underlying IBS and irritable bowel syndrome as well. So it worked really badly for my self-image, a little bit for my self-worth. And a lot of people can be similar or can have a similar experience if you're following the wrong fitness protocol or nutritional protocol. For me in 2015, when I was at the height of that, and I got my pro card in 2014 in the category I was competing in, which just means that you could compete for money. And I went and did the World in Las Vegas in 2015. And I was at the height of that disordered eating pattern. And because of it, it's given me a lot more empathy when I work with people in programs who have that poor food relationship. The last book, The Keen Edge, Mastering the Mindset for Real Lasting Fat Loss, is all about food relationship, not separating food into good and bad categories, knowing that, broccoli is not going to save you from a burning building and a chocolate bar is not going to stab you down a back alley. Food has no morals. We project our morals onto them. And I had to get from 0 to 1 with that because for so long I put certain foods into the good category. Brown rice, broccoli, chicken, porridge. They were the good foods, quote unquote good foods. And I had cake and sweets and chocolate in the quote unquote bad category. And in reality, neither of those foods are good or bad. Some of them are nutrient dense. Some of them are very calorie dense, i.e. a tub of Ben & Jerry's is very high calorie and very low nutrient. Not necessarily bad. Context matters here. If you've been fasting for 7 days, it's probably a good way to get some extra sugar and calories into your system. But if you are already overweight or have a lot of body fat, it's not going to be super supportive in that context. And the same with things like broccoli and brown rice, if we keep those examples. They're foods that are quite high nutrient and quite low calorie, broccoli in particular. But there's contexts where that wouldn't be helpful. In the case of starving for 7 days, you don't want to be sitting trying to get your calories back in by eating a table worth of broccoli. be easy to get a tub of ice cream and it'll probably keep you alive in a shorter period of time. Like, your body's a basic survival and has survived evolutionary to crave those foods in times of scarcity. We just happen to be in modern society where those foods are abundant. So it's easier for us to put on weight. It's easier for us to overconsume calories. And you want to look at your food relationship. But for me, my ladder was against the wrong wall. I was competing in something that was actually diminishing and destroying my self-worth and my self-confidence over time. I had a poor food relationship as a result of it, and I had a poor relationship with training. I was an excessive overtraining. I still do this. I still overtrain a little bit, but I was excessively overtrained during that time. My sleep patterns were dreadful because I was taking enough fat-burning supplements that would literally knock a baby rhinoceros, and I couldn't sleep. So I'd be staring at the ceiling at nighttime, waking at 3 a.m., getting up to go for a run just because I couldn't sleep. And then it was having this negative cycle, very unhealthy lifestyle that I was living. And something that I've talked about at corporate events when I do corporate wellness talks is that difference between health and fitness, because they're two different things. And I would say in 2015, when I was at my most muscular and at my leanest, I was at probably my most unhealthiest. I struggled to sleep. I struggled to maintain my sex drive. I struggled for energy to do basic tasks and basic cognitive functions, but I looked, quote unquote, like I was on the cover of a magazine. I did a lot of photo shoots and things along those lines. So from the outside looking in, I looked like I was in great shape, but health and fitness are two completely different things. And something I try and educate people on is there is a crossover at some point, but they do eventually diverge. You can go too much into the fitness side. And I would argue a lot of fitness influencers online, and not to call anyone out in particular because everyone is trying to do the best they can with the information they have. But some fitness influencers will be very heavy into the, make sure you're not eating any processed food, never drink alcohol, never have sugar, and make sure you're avoiding that, train multiple times a day. And that's all well and good, and that will probably get you lean. It'll cause potentially some health issues, particularly if you're female, because of your monthly menstrual cycle, excessive cortisol, your potential for things like hypothalamic amenorrhea, which I've done a separate podcast on with Catherine Stewart for those who have lost their period for an extended period of time and how to reverse out of that. And you want to be mindful that that's fitness. That's not health. And I had those two things confused. My ladder was up against the wrong wall. And when I came away from that, I decided actually I want to be healthy as well. And I want to be able to balance this. I love training. I love working out, but I'm not healthy right now. I should be able to wake up every day with energy. I shouldn't feel like I've been hit by a bus every single day when I wake up at 6 or 7 a.m. And that allowed me to make that shift. I had it with my work. I've had it with health and fitness. And it's something that I didn't learn until later in life, that you're better to be at the bottom of the ladder against the right wall than halfway up the ladder against the wrong wall. The next one will probably hit home for a lot of you, especially if you're similar to me. And that's that comparison is a never-ending hamster wheel, and it will spin out of control if you let it. Theodore Roosevelt's quote that comparison is the thief of joy was one of my brain tattoos for years, because it's very common and it's been well documented through evolutionary psychology that comparison is something that helped a lot of people survive when we were hunter-gatherer tribes, and it helped our ancestors procreate. And we are basically just replicants of those procreation and those choices and the people that survived. It's the same way as we have the anxiety trigger and the default to fear that a lot of us feel, because that kept our ancestors alive in the savannah 10,000 years ago. That if there was a rustling in the bushes or there was a rustling in the trees and you thought it was a lion or a tiger or a predator trying to eat you, you were better to run away and feel that anxiety and feel that fear, because if you didn't, you became that tiger's dinner for that day, and then you didn't pass on your genes. The Richard Dawkins book, The Selfish Gene, is a very interesting but difficult read. It's one I've put on my book recommendation list on the website for my top 50 book recommendations, with an asterisk caveat, because it's a very difficult read, meaning that you need a decent understanding in basic science to grasp it. It took me 3 attempts. I tried reading it in 2016, didn't understand it, tried again in 2018, got a bit more, and then read it before COVID in 2020 and was like, oh wow, this is actually a very important book for understanding the role that evolution plays and how our genes get passed on and how we're wired to procreate. And when I think about comparison, it's the same. What kept people alive thousands of years ago was you'd see somebody with something more than you, and it set off that trigger in your brain that actually I need to go and get that. In 2024 and beyond, psychologists have a term that they call the vertical expansion of our reference group. And this is where we compare ourselves against people who we've never met, who we've never seen, and who we might be following on social media. When you go back or think back to your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents' time on this earth, they would compare themselves potentially to those in their village, to those in their town, but it was a smaller number of people. In this day and age, we have access to thousands of people. We can follow potentially thousands of people on our social media channels, and our vertical expansion of that reference group goes up. So whether it is comparing your physical appearance, how you look, to other people's highlight reels on social media, whether it's comparing your relationship status to how people are putting across their relationship online, or just anything to do with life and work, you're seeing highlight reels that people are showing you. And one of the biggest wake-up calls for me, and thankfully, this isn't what happened to me directly, but I saw it firsthand with people in my friend and acquaintances networks, particularly when it came to relationships. I remember one in particular where I was following a friend of mine, both the guy and the girl, they were going out as a couple, boyfriend and girlfriend. And I was convinced from their social media feed that they were the happiest couple of all time. They had photos of them. They had photos of them and their child. Were going on trips. They looked so happy. And when they broke up, which they did, it was a horrible breakup. It was one of the worst I've ever seen. There was a lot of nastiness. Unfortunately, their poor child got dragged into the middle of it. I wasn't close enough to either to offer advice, and I wasn't asked. And again, don't offer unsolicited advice to people that don't ask. That is probably another side lesson here that's useful. That will just save you a lot of heartache and pain. And I remember thinking, wow, their relationship looked incredible on social media. And actually now it mustn't have been all that good, because this breakup is horrible. And watching it from the outside, and even their social media feeds, they were very nasty to one another. And it made me think, and this was several years ago, this was even before I turned 30, I was 29 when I saw this. I remember thinking, wow, okay, everything isn't as it seems, and what you see isn't all there is. To quote Daniel Kahneman from the book Thinking Fast and Slow about your type 1 and type 2 thinking systems. It's a great read. Again, another one from my top 50 book recommendation list on the website, briankeenfitness.com. And it made me think, well, not everything I see is all there is. And I started putting everything through that lens with social media. And I even thought back to my 2015 content. And if you scroll back, and it's probably still there on Instagram and different channels I have, my life looked amazing in 2015. I was traveling all around the world. I was doing photo shoots. I was doing competitions. I was sponsored by supplement companies. And I was miserable. I was calorie depleted. I wasn't happy with anything in my life except for that my business was going really well at the time, but I was overworked. I was overstressed. I had a borderline issue with stimulants, meaning that I needed them, and I needed a ridiculous amount of caffeine and stimulants to even get through my day, that my adrenals were completely burnt out. But I didn't show any of that. I didn't explain any of that. I didn't let people see any of that on social media. And those two things together, when I thought in hindsight, looking back on what I was posting, it made me realize that everything isn't as it seems. One, social media is a highlight reel, but that comparison will never end, and it's a hamster wheel that keeps going. Now, when I think of comparison, there are three things that normally help me, and I'm going to break down each one, because at different stages in my life, between my late 20s and early 30s and now my mid 30s, all have helped me at different stages. So I'll share all three in the hopes that they help you. The first one is probably the most obvious and the one I had the most resistance to, but it's given me ridiculous benefit over the years, and that's just gratitude journaling to rewire your brain. When I started researching Rewire Your Mindset, my second book, I went heavy into the psychology, between things like cognitive behavioral therapy, evolutionary psychology, and everything in between. I tried to condense and pull out information and make it in a very digestible way for people, myself included. A lot of that book was just written to a younger version of me. And I understood and learned that we're evolutionarily hardwired for negativity. As I mentioned earlier, it kept our ancestors alive 10,000 years ago. Now it just makes us miserable. And gratitude journaling was something I kept coming across, of rewiring your brain, the neuroplasticity in your brain, a defaulting to negative thinking, the negativity bias. I kept coming across these themes. And every time the solution was gratitude in some shape or form, whether it was gratitude lists, gratitude journaling, gratitude meditations. And I was very resistant to it. I won't lie. And apologies to anyone that's in the US or an American-based listener. I had chalked it up to American woo-woo nonsense. I'm like, there's no way gratitude and writing down what I'm grateful for is going to rewire my brain. That is stupid. And that resistance, now in hindsight, was probably down because this works. And I found it really hard. I found initially being grateful for things, and I have so many blessings in my life. And I had, at the time when I started this practice, probably 7 or 8 years ago, I still found it hard to do. And the secret for me, which might be the same for you, is you have to be consistent with it. You have to do it every day, regardless of how you feel, for at least 66, 67 days. The University of London says it takes about 66 days to form a new habit. And you'll start to see your brain rewiring. That's one of the reasons why I call the book Rewiring Your Mindset, because we have our default thinking, we have our default way that we've gone through the world and experienced it. And because of that, we have all these lessons that are ingrained to us, and we have a false consensus bias that we assume because we think a certain way, so does everybody else. And when you start to challenge that belief system and you start to arm yourself with new information, you start to see the world in a very different way, and you see it through a different lens. And even writing down 5, 10, 15, 20 things every day that you're grateful for will start to rewire that mindset towards a more gratitude-based thinking. And when you do that, it's very difficult to hold comparison and gratitude at the same time, because you end up looking at your life and going, wow, look at all these amazing things I have. Or it can be as basic as, I'm really happy that the sun is shining today, or that the rain it feels like it's cleansing if you're in Ireland and it's raining today. And I found this is something that has happened and has rewired, where now my brain has done enough mental gymnastics that I tend to go to the best case scenario even when bad things happen. And even in my worst cases, and I went through a pretty bad breakup about 9 months ago, and although it was heartbreaking at the time and really difficult, my brain was still thinking, there's a reason for this. Like, I'm going to be a better dad if my daughter Holly ever gets heartbreak, which she inevitably will. I don't think you can go through this world and avoid it in some shape or form, whether it's a breakup or death of a loved one or death of a pet. We go through loss, we go through grief. I covered a recent podcast with David Kessler on this, on the foremost expert in the world on loss and grief. I highly recommend that if you were struggling with a breakup or a divorce or a death of a loved one. And I was finding meaning in it, trying to put a positive spin on it. And I put a lot of that down to the gratitude journaling, where your brain starts to flip towards the grateful, starts to flip towards gratitude, starts to flip towards the positive. But as somebody who has historically had a negative default thought pattern, this is a very powerful method for rewiring that comparison syndrome. The next thing is stop comparing in isolation. I was the worst for this. Oh my God. It's so silly in hindsight when I look back and think that I was comparing myself against people in isolation, meaning that I would look at somebody's body and go, man, I wish I was in that shape. Or I'd look at someone's relationship and go, wow, I wish I was that happy in a relationship when I was single, or if I was single. And I would look at somebody doing better than me in business or social media, and I think, oh my God, I would love that. But life isn't a pick and mix. You can't pick and choose aspects of somebody else's life and then substitute them into yours. You have to do a direct swap. You literally have to body swap. And every time I think about somebody that is perceived to be doing better than me in business, in life, in fitness, in health, in whatever I deem to be value. All our values are very subjective. It's very important to determine what your values are, because you make decisions and move through this world depending on whatever value you have. If you have junk values that I talk about in Rewire Your Mindset, you're going to find that you're making decisions that are actually making your life worse. Whereas when you have true values and you hold, being a family person or showing up and serving the world or having a value of health, you're going to make better decisions off the back of that. And when I start to think about comparing in isolation and I go, right, that person is doing better in business or that person is in better shape, I ask myself, would I swap my entire life with them? So everything I have from all my loved ones, my friends, my family, my daughter, my business, would I swap all this life with that person? And in every scenario for me, the answer has been no. Nearly every scenario, because the grass isn't always green on the other side. It's normally green on the side that you look after. And when I think about that isolation, if I can take inspiration for it, because comparison is a very funny thing. Only you know when it's negatively impacting your life, because a small amount of comparison can be very motivational, very inspirational. Too much of it can make you feel really bad about yourself and can lead to some analysis paralysis where you just overthink everything because you're like, well, what's the point? I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to have that body. I'm never going to have that amount of money. I'm never going to have that relationship. And then that affirmation or negative affirmation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you basically, whatever you think is what you'll become. And you need to be very mindful of those thoughts without going too esoteric and woo-woo. You do have to catch those things, I believe. And when you think about that person that you would swap with, ask yourself, okay, what did it take to get them there? And when I think of the version of me that was the most muscular and in the most ripped shape, I had to trade nearly all my mental health for that. I had to trade a lot of my physical health for that, because of all the different drugs I was taking, the different supplements I was taking, the different everything. Anything I could do that would help me, that came in a tablet or a pill form, I would literally be like, cool, give me that. If it's going to make me bigger, if it's going to make me leaner, if it's going to help me place better in shows, I'm all over that. And it came at the cost, because everything we choose in this world comes at a cost. And it was physical and mental health for me. I would never pay that price again, looking back. I did it once and I was miserable doing it. And when you think about others that you're comparing yourself to, sometimes the thing that made them successful is because they had to give up other areas. It's very hard to be an amazing business person with a multiple 10-figure business and have a good family life. It's very difficult to balance that, from my experience talking with people. And the same with some of the top athletes, some I've spoken to on the podcast, some I know privately, who excel at their sport and they're tremendous at what they do, but their personal life is in ruins, because what got them to the top of their field meant that they had to sacrifice elsewhere. So everything doesn't come, and comparison doesn't come in isolation. So stop comparing other people's body, status, relationship, business achievements, because if you want what they have, you need to take everything in their life too. And that includes the good and the bad. And then the final thing when it comes to comparison is play the game differently. And if you insist on playing a torturous, self-inflicted comparison game, which we all do from time to time, you at least have to go both directions. So every time you compare yourself to someone who's ahead of you, compare yourself with two people who are behind you on that journey. Your fitness journey, your wellness journey, your weight loss journey, your business journey. It's so easy for us to have that vertical expansion of the reference group and compare against people up that are ahead of us. But a lot of cases, there's people behind us too that we don't see, and we're not focused on them. And I think if you can balance it out, generally with negativity bias, the general rule of thumb is that you need at least 2 positive situations or scenario to outdo 1 negative. So for example, if you've got negative comments on your social media, your brain is automatically driven towards the negative one, and you normally need 2 to 3 positive experiences to outweigh that negativity. And that's what I would do. If you insist on playing this comparison game and you do it by default because you haven't rewired your mindset completely to stop doing that, start comparing downwards as well, people who are behind you on your journey, and that will at least kind of even out the playing field so that you're not going to make yourself miserable with that comparison. And as I mentioned, comparison isn't always a bad thing. Small amounts of it can be really motivational or inspirational. Only you know when it's negatively impacting your life. Just know that it's a never-ending hamster wheel, and it will spin out of control if you let it. The next one is something that I learned quite a while ago, but I'm embarrassed to admit it took me longer to learn than I would have cared to admit. And that's, if you're tired, learn to rest, not to quit. I talked about in The Keen Edge, my last book, about pressing the fuck it button. Normally in the context of nutrition or diet, where you think, okay, I'm just going to press the fuck it button with my diet. It's the weekend, fuck it. I'm going to eat what I want. I'll reset again on Monday. Or you have one bad meal and then you say, fuck it, press the fuck it button and go, right, I'm going to eat whatever I want now. The equivalent of driving on the motorway, getting a flat tire and then going out and slashing the other 3 tires because one went flat. That's the equivalent of pressing the fuck it button, particularly with your diet. In a lot of cases, if you're tired, you need to rest and not to quit. And it's so funny because a lot of areas of life cross over. In Rewire Your Mindset, in the course and in the book, I split things into the 4 quadrants. So health, wealth, love, and fulfillment. They're the quadrants I still break my life into this day. My health, my physical health, my appearance, etc. My wealth, my investments, my ability to generate money and serve people, my love, my personal life, my family, my friends, and then my fulfillment, my work and what I get to do. I still break things into those 4 quadrants. And sometimes it is very tempting to put all your time and effort into one thing and for it to come at the cost of something else. Similar to what I talked about earlier with high achievers, sometimes the thing that makes people really high achieving in one particular area means that it comes at the cost of another area of their life. And historically, I have quit things in the past because I've just overcommitted. And when I started to compete in ultra marathons, and my first ever ultra marathon was the Marathon des Sables in 2018, the 6 back-to-back marathons through the Sahara Desert in consecutive days. And a philosophy that is very abundant amongst ultra runners is that if you're tired, you learn to rest and you don't quit. And ultra marathons, which for anyone unfamiliar with that, is just basically anything over a marathon distance. So 26.2 miles is a marathon distance. Anything over is an ultra marathon. So I've done a couple of consecutive ones like the Marathon des Sables. I ran through the Arctic a year later, which was 5 days, 230 kilometers. And then I did a 100-mile ultra marathon in Nevada in 2020, right before the COVID lockdown. And one of the ways you have to approach those races is very similar to how I would advise people sometimes approach things in life. And that is that you have to slow down and take a figurative step back for 2 steps forward. And on something like a 100-miler, a lot of people will take a break at mile 25, at mile 50, at mile 75. Some people will even sleep. I don't on my 100-milers. I've always historically gone straight through the night for 24 hours. I actually do quite well without sleep when I'm able to train and condition my body to do it. I pay for it out the far side, but I'm able to do it because I remove caffeine and stimulants several weeks before, and then I reintroduce them, or historically I've reintroduced them during races. I do less ultras now. I don't self-punish with exercise the same way that I did now going into my kind of mid to late 30s. And I've achieved most of those things that I wanted to do within ultra and within running. And as someone that's not a fan of running and has been very vocal on this podcast and on social media that I dislike running, I like having ran. I like the achievement. I like the self-discipline that comes with it, but I don't enjoy running. And because of that, taking other life lessons, such as learning to rest, not to quit, has actually helped me a lot with business. It's helped me a lot with relationships, actually to my detriment sometimes with relationships, that sometimes, yes, sometimes you should quit something. If you're up against the ladders, against the wrong wall with your job, with your relationship, with your business, with your work, with your whatever it is you're doing and your life choices, your health, your wellness, your fitness, your nutrition, your training, sometimes you should quit. Sometimes there is an argument for, look, your ladder's against the wrong wall. You metaphorically or figuratively need to come back down and move it against another wall. That can be a lot of time, energy, and effort. We get caught in the sunk cost fallacy, which is something that I wish I knew when I was 25, 26. The sunk cost fallacy is a figurative term where you throw good money after bad or good time after bad, meaning that you stay in a relationship because you've been in it for so long, although you know it's the wrong one, or you stay in a job because you've done it for so long and it's what you know, or you stay on a hamster wheel of comparison, or even a hamster wheel of slimming clubs and dietary protocols that don't serve you over the long term because it's what you know. And there's that sunk cost fallacy of, well, I put so much time, energy, and effort into this, I'm just going to keep going. And a way I get around that, and this is just a personal question I ask myself, is if I was starting from zero, would I still do this thing? Would I still be with this person? Would I still do this business? Would I still train this way? Would I still serve the way that I serve within my consulting? And when the answer is no, it's normally a sign that actually you have to just forget about the time, energy, money, and focus that you've put into the past with something. You need to actually start putting the new time, energy, and effort into getting your ladder up against that right wall. And sometimes there's a time when you should quit. But in 90% of the cases, from my experience and from working with people over the years, it's not that you should quit because it got too hard or because it's too difficult. If it's worthwhile and worth doing, the reason that it's difficult is because not everybody can do it. And sometimes to get yourself to a finish line, you have to learn to rest. I remember when I was on day 3 in the desert in Marathon des Sables, and it was after 2 marathons, 2.5 marathons, and my feet were destroyed. They were just mangled from blisters from the heat. And I thought I was going to die. I was just like, oh my God, I'm so overheated. This is so difficult. What was I thinking? Why am I here? And I thought, okay, I just need to get some composure. I just need to take a breather here. And I ended up finding some shade. There are sections of shade in the Sahara. And I just took 10 minutes. I just sat under a rock and under a tree in the Sahara and regained my composure and thought to myself, okay, I'm here because I chose to be here. This suffering is suffering I chose. I want to show my daughter that it's important that you challenge yourself and that you can get through difficult things. I wanted to have content that I could potentially share with people, and I ended up using some of those messages in Rewire Your Mindset, my second book. So a lot of reasons, and my why, finding your why, is a theme within my life and one I recommend people check in with, because when you're trying to do difficult things, sometimes your why needs to be bigger than you. My daughter has been a massive anchor for me in my life. Not everyone that's listening has kids, but you have a why, whether it's something internal for you or for a family member or for somebody that you want to inspire. You have to check in with that, because in my example, again, focus group of 1, sometimes it needs to be bigger than you. And I check in with that regularly. And in the Sahara, it was something that got me going. It was 10 minutes to finish out the rest of the marathon. And because of that, I still apply it to this day when I'm making decisions. If I'm tired, if I'm run down, I learn to rest, not to quit. It's what gives you longevity in fitness. It's what gives you longevity in business. It's what can potentially give you longevities in relationships. I'm not an expert on that. I'm more so quoting from other expert relationship guidance psychologists and counselors who have been on the podcast, that there is a time and a place to work through things, and there's a time and a place to take a step back. But ultimately, if you're tired with whatever it is you're doing, in most cases, you need to learn to rest, not to quit. And that's an acquired skill. Number 4, if your reaction is hysterical, it's probably historical. This has been a theme with psychologists that I brought up in the podcast recently, where this is my ultimate check-in with reactions that I have that are disproportionate to what's actually going on in front of me. And one of the lenses, or one of the filters that I put my reactions through, is if it's hysterical, it's probably historical. And this was very evident for me. Romantic relationships really tend to show this one up. And I've done several podcasts with the likes of Louise Carroll. We talked about this on the podcast a little bit with David Kessler, the grief expert. We talk about it in an upcoming episode with Jennifer Mann, that sometimes you can have that role, and Thais Gibson actually is the other episode, that we can have this role that where we try and relive our romantic relationships through the lens of our primary caregivers, and that a lot of our shit, a lot of our self-worth, our values, our belief systems, all of these can come up in a romantic relationship as we try and kind of navigate what is effectively a tango or a dance between two people, where both are using some of their core wounds that are coming up. Some are using previous emotional baggage from relationships reappearing in this new relationship, in this new dynamic. And the focus group of 1, I'll put my hand up here, but romantic relationships tend to be the real shining light. Carl Jung talks about the shadow self. I talked about this in the episode with Orla O'Flaherty when we were talking about breakups and divine, feminine, masculine, that Carl Jung speaks about the shadow side. So the side of our personality that Carl Gustav Jung, who's a philosopher and a psychologist who worked under some of the Freudian theory and then went off and did his own school of thought, his Jungian psychological theory. And one of his lines, which is one of my personal favorites, that your roots need to go down to hell for your branches to reach up to heaven. That's one of my personal mantras, one of my life philosophies when I'm going through difficult times, in particular, self-inflicted and self-chosen and others. And Carl Jung speaks about that shadow side, the part of ourselves that we're not happy to look at, the part of ourselves that feels insecure or jealous or isolated or lonely or unloved or unvalued or unworthy. And romantic relationships can bring these up in a lot of people. And parenting can also do this. I've had experiences with my daughter Holly that I will react hysterically to something she's done. And if I don't catch it in the moment and go, what the fuck, Brian? I'm like, that's not even your reaction. They're not even your words. You end up effectively running through a similar process to how you were parented, and that cycle just continues until you break it, particularly the parts of it that didn't serve you and won't serve your children. And children and romantic relationships tend to be the two scenarios where this shows up, in my experience anyway. And generally, if I'm having an hysterical reaction, it's historical, meaning that if somebody does something and it triggers real anger within me, that's a really prominent one, where I get disproportionately enraged or annoyed at something happening. I have to go, oh shit, who's the original character in this? This isn't what's happening and playing out in front of me right now. This is from an old relationship, or this is from something that happened with my father, or something that happened with my mother, or something that happened with a primary caregiver or a teacher or a coach, something that was said that was planted there. And it's really interesting. I remember, and this is, again, processing this in real time, so bear with me, something that I've set a goal and a target for 2024. I'm setting up to do salsa dancing because I want to learn how to dance. And something that I didn't do for most of my 20s and 30s was I didn't dance. I refused to flat out dance because I was so self-conscious around it. I was like, I can't dance. And I remember thinking that was put there by somebody else. We used to get made fun of. We were called kind of flimsy and all the Western Ireland language that was completely derogatory now and that I wouldn't repeat when you want to dance, because it's a beautiful way to move energy. You know, emotion is energy in motion, and dancing is a great way to move through that. It's a beautiful way to heal without actually having to go and do really deep work like therapy or plant medicines, etc. You can heal in lots of different ways, and movement is one way to do that. And dancing for me was something I was so self-conscious around. And when I started to unpack that and go, where the fuck did that come from? It was from being made fun of when I was younger. It was from sections of people, grown men, coaches, father figures who were like, you can't do that, prissies dance, and all the language that came around it. And I historically took that on board. And I was like, no, I can't dance. I feel really self-conscious around that. So that's a belief system I've actively been challenging in 2024. So stay tuned for this. In 2025, I'll put up some salsa reels on social media and you'll be like, oh, Brian got over his dancing thing. Hopefully, fingers crossed. We'll see how that goes. But again, a lot of those stories were implanted and given to us by other people. So you have to question those. And one of the first steps for that is asking, okay, am I responding hysterically to this? And for me, when somebody would be like, do you want to go to dance, or do you want to dance on a night out or at a wedding? I was like, no, fuck no, I don't dance. I don't dance. I don't dance. I don't dance. It was just a hard, nearly a hysterical response, just a hard no, without like, actually, this might be fun. I really like this song. And that's how I knew it was hysterical. It took me a long time to get to this, probably a decade. It's why I wish I knew in my 20s. But all those belief systems, your worthiness, the things you're afraid to do, the things you feel self-conscious about, in a lot of cases, they were put there by somebody else. The thing I spoke about on several podcasts, and we went through it with the life coach, Mark Fennell, that I do the thought experiment. If I hit a factory reset, would I still feel this way now? And the dancing was an example for me, that if I hit a factory reset and I go back to when I was 7 or 8 years old and you'd be dancing around, to me it was Michael Jackson at the time. I used to love Thriller and Billie Jean, and I used to love it as a kid. And as an adult, I grew away from it completely. But if you hit a factory reset, I wouldn't have had any of that self-conscious feeling around it. And that's something that we can apply to multiple areas of your life. So ask yourself if any of your reactions, whether it's just a default, no, hard, I never dance, I always do this, that's feedback that there's a wound there somewhere that you might need to unpack. Again, I highly recommend the episode with David Kessler on loss and grief for working through some of those core wounds so that you don't have them showing up in relationships or in your life in a negative way, or in your business companionships or business work colleagues where people are triggering you, and not seeing those triggers as a gift. Those triggers are feedback. I always think of the Ram Dass quote that suffering is just showing you where you still have attachment. And if you can remove a lot of the attachment from situations by working through your core wounds and seeing that a lot of them are hysterical because they're historical, you can move through life in a much more peaceful way, a much more loving way, and in a much more calm way. And that's coming from someone who has a massive history of mental health issues, who wish I'd known that 10 years ago. And it's something and a seed I would have tried to nurture and cultivate had I known then what I know now. Number 5, what's meant for you won't pass you, even if it doesn't feel like that at the time, and what didn't work out possibly did if you give it enough time. I have to props to Mommy Kane for this, or Mommy Keen, because this was something my mother used to always tell me and my sister, and she still does to this day. What's meant for you won't pass you. And it's become one of my internal belief systems that's really serving. I talked about questioning belief systems earlier, but the ones that are serving you, I tend to keep, i.e. the gratitude journaling. But this is one also. when going through very difficult times, sometimes you have to anchor yourself that this is for the best, even if it doesn't feel this way now. And I've had those moments in my life. I think of my career, my job, particularly when I was working as a teacher, and I came home to Christmas after working for 4 or 5 months as a teacher. And I remember going out one night at Christmas. Jesus Christ. When I think about this, I went out and had a few drinks, and you're not supposed to drink and drive ever, but this was, more than a decade ago, 12 years ago. So any guards or police listening, please don't arrest me now in hindsight or in foresight or whatever the correct language or terminology is for that. But I had a few drinks and I was driving home, and I remember thinking, man, I fucking hate my job. I hate London. I hate where I am. I'm so sick of this. And I was coming up to a turnaround close to where my mum and dad lived, where I was staying at the time. And there's a bridge. And I remember speeding up the car as I was coming to the bridge. And I don't know what I was even thinking at the time. I was just feeling a little bit depressed and just not happy with the way things were going. And as I came up to that bridge, I banged on the brakes and the car spun 180 in the middle of the road. And it was about 2 a.m. in the morning. So thankfully there was nobody coming or going either side. And I woke up the next morning thinking, Jesus Christ, did that actually happen? What the fuck am I doing? And I had a big pity party for myself. Then I remember crying to my mum that Christmas going, I fucking hate my job, and having a real pity party and a real sob story for myself, thinking that, my life is so terrible, when in reality, if you put my problem into a list of loads of other people's problems, I wouldn't be long taking my ones back. But my mum said to me in that conversation, what would you do for free? And something that I put into Rewire Your Mindset, something I mentioned a lot on this podcast. And I was like, I would work in fitness for free. I was like, I'd love to do something in a gym. And that's what set me off for what I would argue, my career, my mission, my life path, the thing that I'm doing now. Although I do a lot with businesses now, working with mentees and working with helping other personal trainers and physiotherapists and health and wellness coaches get their business up and running, moving online, scaling, it's still helping in the grander scheme within a similar space. And at the time, I remember thinking, I've wasted all this energy and money on becoming a teacher, and it's a job I don't want to do. But in reality, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Same as my most recent relationship. And that didn't end very well. Again, a very good person, very, very good things to say about her on a personal level. But the relationship dynamic didn't work out. And I remember thinking at the time, going, fuck, I thought this was it. I thought this is in game. And in hindsight, looking back now, 9-10 months later, I'm like, okay, that is actually potentially going to be one of the best things that ever happens to me, because in your weakest moments, the strongest version of you is waiting to be born. And I lived through that mantra, and I constantly, and on my phone, had the screensaver that when the caterpillar thought it was the end of the world, the butterfly knew it was just the beginning. And a part of me knew that I'm going through this for a reason. Whether it's my daughter when she struggles with a breakup and I can be more empathetic, or just being a better, more well-rounded person, working through some of my shadow issues, working through some of my self-worth and self-love issues, working through some of my insecurities, that all is going to pan out, because what's meant for you won't pass you. And at the time, especially when things are difficult, and I don't want to be a bright side optimist when someone's going through a difficult time, because the last thing you want to fucking hear is someone saying it's going to be okay when you're in the middle of it. You just want someone to acknowledge it, to witness your grief, to witness the loss, to witness the pain, and just be like, do you know what? I feel shit. Can you just say that it's fucking shit and just acknowledge that this sucks? And sometimes that's what you need. It's what I needed anyway. But once you come out of that, and you think that, well, actually, what didn't work out really did, if you give it enough time, if you do enough reflection, if you learn the lessons, because you won't repeat those lessons, whether it's a career, whether it's a relationship, whether it's health and fitness, whether it's a diet, you won't repeat the same mistakes if you learn from them and you reflect them and go, well, this didn't work out. Why didn't this work out? It's a post-mortem of the choices and the decisions you made. I like the Charlie Munger philosophy of doing a pre-mortem. His famous line is, tell me where I'm going to die and I just won't go there. And you can do pre-mortems on things and they're all well and good. But generally, all the treasure is in the trauma. It's in the difficulties, and pulling yourself out of those difficulties and using the suffering for that post-traumatic growth. That's where what's meant for you won't pass you really shines. And if you're going through a difficult time right now, even if you think whatever it is that you wanted to happen, it didn't pan out or didn't work out for you the way you thought, give it enough time. And in a lot of cases, with enough reflection, with enough thinking about the decisions you made, the choices you made, the person you became within that period, and the person you need to become after it, there can be a lot of post-traumatic growth in that. And if it's something you're struggling with, I know it firsthand from certain experiences in my life, and a lot of people have gone through a lot worse than me. But to quote Winston Churchill, one of my favorite lines, when you're going through hell, just make sure you keep going. Number 6, just be nicer to yourself. This one's going to be nice and short. Life is hard enough at the best of times, and beating yourself up rarely helps. When Louise Carroll was on the podcast and we were talking about triggers and core wounds and relationships, she had a line about an eviscerating inner critic that I instantly connected with. And the problem with this for me was that eviscerating inner critic can lead to a lot of external success. And from the outside looking in, it can become something that becomes, I won't say glorified, but it's hard to break a cycle when you're actually having external success. When I started competing in fitness shows first, when I set up a fitness business, part of the reason that I was able to do so well in those areas is, one, fitness and business have a lot of overlap. If you put in the reps, you put in the hours, you tend to get the results, especially if you're pointing in the correct direction and your focus attention follows where that direction should be flowing. But I was able to get up early and put in those hours, put in the reps in the gym, because if I didn't, my self-critic and inner dialogue would literally eviscerate me for the day. And the stuff I would talk and the way I would speak to myself, you wouldn't speak to your worst enemy. And I thought it was a positive thing. And part of the reason I struggled with anxiety for so long was because I couldn't let go of it, because I thought I needed it. I thought that if I don't have anxiety, if I don't constantly worry about what's going to happen, I'm not going to be in good shape. I'm not going to have a successful business. I'm not going to have enough money. And that scarcity mindset and that lack mindset kept me in this negative feedback loop where I would get anxious. I would feel horrible about being anxious, but I thought I needed that tool in order to actually get up and do the work, put in the reps in the gym, get a successful business, get a fit body, all of these things. What I know now that I didn't know then was there's lots of different tools and paths and roads to success. Success is a very subjective thing. You ask 100 people what success looks like for them, you're going to get 100 different answers, most likely. So you have to determine first and foremost, what does success look like for you? For me, it's having financial freedom. It's having time freedom that I can spend it with family, loved ones. I like being able to pick Holly up from school and be able to go to the playground on a random Thursday. I like being able to do these things in terms of freedom. It's a high value for me. So I make a lot of my life choices determined and based on that freedom. And when it came to the anxiety, I couldn't let go of it because I was afraid everything would drop underneath me like a house of cards. And when I started to flip my mindset and rewire my mindset, that actually it's my discipline that makes me successful in business. It's my love of serving people that helps me be successful in business. It's the great endorphin release I get from exercise that helps me stick to a regimen. It's the energy and vitality I get from my food that makes me stick to my diet. They're basically the same outputs. They're the same external things in terms of you're making similar choices, but they're driven and fueled by a different thing, similar to your petrol or your diesel for your car versus, an electric car. Same destination, same output. It's just coming from a different source. And for me, I would be so critical of myself that it would just lead to these spirals and conversations and dialogues that you'd be, you would never speak to your worst enemy in. And I want to keep this one nice and short, that just be nicer to yourself. The way that you look, the way that you are, all those things you're struggling with, beating yourself up rarely helps them. And being more kind and being more compassionate to yourself, whether you are on a journey, and I do this with a lot of my weight loss clients and my BKF online program in particular, particularly those who struggle with self-confidence, struggle with self-image, I'm like, please just be more compassionate to yourself. Please be kinder to yourself. Yes, you fell off your diet this weekend, but the world didn't end. You're not a bad person because you had a few extra slices of cake or a few extra slices of pizza. In fact, maybe your body and your soul needed it at that moment. but please just be kinder to yourself, be compassionate with yourself. We can get on a nutritional plan again. We can get back into our training regimen. We can use those extra calories to have stronger or even better workout sessions. There are positive reframes we can put on this, but just be nicer to yourself. When I think about business, when I think about relationships, when I think about everything that we do, most people in this world, whether we know it or not, and I do believe this, most people are doing the best they can with the information they have at the time. And yeah, people will do bad things to us, and they'll do things that make us hurt or feel pain or trigger us or make us feel uncomfortable or unworthy or unloved. But it's normally not out of badness. I do believe, yeah, you're going to have some psychopaths and some sociopaths who will move through the world, and it might be a better place if they weren't here. But as a majority, I think people are doing the best they can with the information they have, and you're exactly the same. Every decision you've made up until this point, anything that you might regret, decisions you've made in the past, you did the best you could with the information you had at the time. So please just be nicer to yourself. Life is hard enough at the best of times, and beating yourself up rarely helps. Which ties me in nicely to my last point. You can't control anything that happens to you, but you can control how you react to it. The Serenity Prayer, which I regularly butcher, but I have internalized, so I'm good at quotes, but for some reason I can never remember the Serenity Prayer without bringing it up visually in front of me. But it's, God grant me the serenity to understand the things I can change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And when it comes to anything that happens to you, and this might be everything from people doing you a bad turn to maybe some trauma that you've experienced in your life, small trauma, little t trauma or big T trauma, something I've discussed in previous podcasts. You can't control anything that's happened to you, but you can control how you react to it. And that reframe, that one outlook, can put you back in the driving seat. And the analogy I use in the Rewire Your Mindset course when it comes to things like control is we feel a lot of anxiety and mental health issues when we feel like we're out of control, when we feel like we're spinning and we don't know when we're going to stop. And that's not a very pleasant place to be. For me, when I would get the most anxious, it was nearly always in things that I had no control over. Placings in shows, money problems, or relationship problems. A lot of my problems completely self-created because our brains are a problem-seeking machine. Well, mine is anyway, that if I have one problem and I fix it or address it, it moves on to the next one. When I started to release some of those judgments, and I do regular meditation, I meditate every day now, and I just realized that my brain is just a problem-seeking machine, that it doesn't matter how amazing my life is, internally, externally, extrinsically, intrinsically, my brain will just seek to look for problems. Like if I have all my financial issues sorted, it will look for problems in a relationship. If all the relationship stuff is good, it'll look for a problem in business. My brain just literally goes like a heat-seeking missile from one problem to the next. And meditating helped me a lot because it creates a space between that thought and that reaction. And in between that space, you can make a decision to go, well, I'm actually not going to react to this. I'm not going to follow that train of thought. That's actually not helpful for me. And meditation, although it took me about 3 years to learn how to meditate, it's something that gives me a lot of peace now. But it also means that I can control how I react to things. And even in the worst situations, and I use, Oprah Winfrey's a very inspirational example here of someone who's been through as much physical, sexual, and emotional trauma as anyone could have gone through in a life, and came out the other side and took responsibility. Not that it happened to her, but took responsibility for the healing. And now went on and had a very positive impact in the world. I find great inspiration in that. And I think when you start to reframe things, that even the worst situations in your life, whether it's been a job loss, a breakup, a career change that didn't go to plan, a death of a loved one, God forbid, because it's a horrible thing to experience. Again, we talked about that in the episode with David Kessler. For anyone that needs to move through that and wants more support with that, I'm not the person to speak with, but he helped me greatly when it comes to understanding the need for grief to be witnessed and what paths to potentially take for someone that's on that healing journey. But ultimately that you can't control what happens to you, but you have control of how you react to it, what podcasts you listen to, whether you go to therapy or not, the people you spend time with, if you decide to heal and move through it, if you decide to have a healthier journey, if you decide to change your food choices. If you were somebody that grew up in an environment where you were given a lot of poor junk food and that was what you grew up with, yes, that happened to you and that's what you were given, but you can control how you react to it now. You can choose to learn a bit more about your gut microbiome and changing those cravings. You can learn and potentially work with a coach or a trainer who can help you move past that, break through some of your barriers with food psychology or your food behavior. We have choices. And in a lot of cases, when we can't control what's happened to us, we can then potentially take the responsibility to control how we react to it. And for me, and again, focus group of one, which has been a scenario and a theme to this podcast, it's something that's given me a great amount of peace because we are in full control of how we react to things. There are 7 core lessons I learned in my 30s, but really wish I knew in my 20s. I think, and hopefully this is a podcast that connected and resonated as a bit more of a press, record and talk style episode. And if you picked up bits and pieces, let me know. Hit me up on Instagram. Please leave a rating and a review. If you haven't already, if you're on Spotify, you can leave a rating. If you're on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a rating and a review. It helps massively with the growth of the show and bringing on other expert guests, such as some of the ones I've mentioned in today's podcast that can help you with your journey. And as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, it is sponsored by my business mentorship and my consultancy business coaching for those of you working in business who want to go to the next level, who want to move online, who want to scale and grow your business in the health, wellness, or fitness industry. Check out the link in the description below for applications for the mentorship and the coaching. Mentorship is generally full. There's a waiting list for that. The coaching tends to be open more year round because it's less time consuming on my side in terms of the input, but I'll put the details for both below. Thank you so much again for listening. Catch you all next Monday.